creative and again meeting between Africa and Australia to achieve some major opportunities together. Excellencies, High Commissioners, Vice Chancellors, scholars, students, distinguished guests, it's a real pleasure to us invite you here and to have you here. Thank you for coming.
I really like forums like this and universities that can give opportunities to our futures. Collaborative on futures, I emphasize the importance of collaborating like AAU for nurturing future leaders, as I mentioned earlier. I look forward to hearing about the outcomes for today's forum and for the many others events that are taking place this week as we celebrate the African Down Under. I encourage all of you to actively participate. It is really important to exchange ideas, because without exchanging ideas, we cannot achieve many, and to engage in a meaningful discussion. Thank you all for allowing me to actually welcome you on behalf of the Cook government, and thank you, David. So it was a pleasure working with all of you. And have a lovely day. I was only given 3 minutes, so I hope I haven't gone.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much for all the arrangements to invite us again, especially after COVID, where it has taken a little while for us to get off the ground again. Last year we had the wonderful occasion here. This year, the first one after COVID, the AAU Africa Forum hosted in collaboration with Africa Week at the University of Pretoria during May, and back here again. We're really very fortunate, and I'm very proud to say that we have 9 universities from the African continent represented here. We have Professor Barnabas Nabwanye, the Vice Chancellor of Makerere University, also the Chairperson of Varula. Thank you very much, Professor, for coming all the way. We have Professor David Norris, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Botswana, here with us. We have Professor Loretta Ferres, the Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University of Pretoria, representing the Vice Chancellor and the University. Thandi Mkhwebi, the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. Aldous Strubel, the Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University of Mpumalanga. Professor Didas, the Vice Chancellor of the National University of Rwanda. Professor Sobyi from University of Mauritius. Professor Amokne from Bahardari University. I don't see him here yet. And Professor Siva Kumar, representing the Tshwane University of Technology. So we can see with 9 African universities represented, we really take it very serious. And I must say, we really want to also extend our appreciation to the National Research Foundation for supporting the AAUN Africa branch, not only in terms of mobilization to make this possible, but also more recently, a grant has been made to AAUN Africa again to make seed funds available, and the announcement for that will also follow soon. Then finally, I want to introduce Jonathan Tager. He's the new Secretariat for AAUN Africa. You have seen and heard a lot from Jonathan over the last 3-4 months building up to this, or even before that, but you will certainly see and hear a lot more from him in future.
Start my remarks by recognizing the elder Nick Abraham, representing the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which where this morning gathered. I also want to recognize the Venerable Church representing the jurisdiction on which we are focusing this morning. I want to extend my recognition to Professor Helen and Professor Swanepoel, the co-chairs of this esteemed network. Our host, of course, is Lady Name Edward, being the host and the Vice Chancellor of the University of Pretoria. should the issue be, the constraining factor be logistics or communication and coordination? Perhaps a starting point would be to start by increasing the number of African universities for which we have ambassadors accredited to the Commonwealth of Australia. This is because the accreditation to Australia of the African embassies bodes well for coordination, such as participation at the AAUN annual forums. Besides the ease of coordination, it goes without saying that the few African diplomatic embassies accredited to Australia are so accredited not by accident, but because their presence is a reflection of the fact that there is ongoing mutually beneficial cooperation between their respective countries and Australia. In addition, these embassies are accredited to Australia because they see scope for further mutually beneficial cooperation, including in areas yet to be developed.
Protocols of serve. Good morning to you all.
Good morning.
And what a privilege to be together this morning. All thinkers, creators, partners, architects of one of the most beautiful enterprise of human race. Allow me to pay my respect to all elders past, present and emerging, and recognize that we are at the land of ancestors and recognize the presence of Nick, Abraham. So,
particular, some of you may be familiar with ChatGPT. That has been a disruptive element because all of a sudden we had to rethink education, we had to rethink assessment in higher education. But it permeates through different areas. And let me use one example, and that is agriculture, which is one that is important in the African context. AI has been used to assist farmers in numerous ways. For example, to adapt to climate change. It can predict the accuracy of droughts much more precisely. But more specifically, there's also a new trend towards AI and what is called precision farming. So AI is used to detect pests. It can detect levels of, or specifically target specific weeds. It can determine how much herbicide is needed for a particular crop in very precise and minute details, and can apply it correctly in the correct fashion, in the correct zone, according to the climate and the precipitation, etc., etc. But there's very little application of this form of precision AI farming in Africa. Yet it can be a game changer for big scale farming, for small scale farming. But we need more joint research on this, and we need to understand how these technologies can be rolled out to farmers on both continents. And I'll come back to this. But having said that, I think we also need to play a very important role in the responsible and ethical use of AI in critical areas, such as the ones that we've identified for this network, in particular in education, in health and employment, where AI has the potential to displace jobs, especially jobs that require lower levels of skills. And that, we know, is also an area that is of concern for us in Africa. But here's the thing, AI is predominantly being generated in English. And so if you want to create an app, for example, for a farmer in Ghana to use precision farming, you cannot have an app in English. That is the one problem. The second problem is we know that farming, especially in Africa, is generated or is driven not just by knowledge and skills that comes from the Western world, but also through our own knowledge, our own skills. We apply indigenous knowledge systems, especially at the small scale level. And if precision farming is only focusing on sort of conventional farming methods, then we will continue to stay behind. So I've got 1 minute left. So let me talk in just that 1 minute about what we are doing in this space at the University of Pretoria. We have what is called the APSA UP Chair of Data Science, the chair that is co-sponsored by industry. And that can be used, I think, very productively as a springboard and a bridge to drive Africa, Australia, and Indo-Pacific partnerships on AI through joint mobility, joint research project on the techno-social issues of AI advances and how we can make sure that local populations in particular are not left behind. We have already existing collaborations with some of the universities in this room, Makerere, Ghana, to just name a few. And we are, through this chair, we are driving the rollout of AI, the rollout of AI in local languages. We are mobilizing youth all over Africa to do this, to bring together their skills to begin to develop AI in local languages. And so I think what I want to leave you with is that we think over the next few days how we can use this network to generate more support for these kinds of endeavors. Thank you.
Respects to the traditional guardians of this land, represented by Elder Nick Abraham. Thank you for your welcome. Excellencies, Vice Chancellors, Professors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Australia has a tendency to keep rediscovering Africa. I know that because I've now lived some decades. I grew up in Tanzania, of Australian parents, came to Australia for my tertiary education at Sydney University, joined Foreign Affairs, served in Nairobi, was High Commissioner in Nigeria, served with the Commonwealth Secretariat, was Ambassador in Zimbabwe, Assistant Secretary for Africa, and then First Assistant Secretary for Middle East and Africa, and most recently Ambassador in the Netherlands. So after a few years away, I'm returning to Africa through this wonderful conference. It's so good to see it thriving despite the challenges of COVID. And I want to really pay respects to John Hearn and his team, both in Africa and Australia, who have done this. When I came back from the Commonwealth Secretariat in 2009, Australia was running for the Security Council. Incidentally, we're running again. This could be good for Africa-Australia relations. But we had lost very badly back in 1996. As a young officer, I was involved in that campaign, and it was clear, I did the analysis on this, that it was Africa and our lack of engagement with Africa, our shutting of posts, our cutting back of development assistance. And we were fortunate enough to have a West Australian as Foreign Minister in Stephen Smith, now our High Commissioner in London, still very actively engaged. And he got me to run an Africa task force to come up with a new Africa policy. And I have to say, I think the Rudd-Gillard government was the high point of our relations with Africa. We entered into diplomatic relations with all African countries. These all came from the recommendations of the task force. We actually, and we were expanding our development assistance at that time, hoping to reach 0.5%. I regret to say we're only at 0.2% of GNI at the present time, well below the OECD average of 3.5%. So the Australian government has to do a lot on development support, not just in Africa, where it gives virtually nothing now, but more generally as well, and Africa will benefit from that because we do need some development support in Africa. And you've heard about the Australian awards that thankfully still continue, but need to be expanded again, because that was another key recommendation, expanding the Australia Awards, which were minimal at the time. We now have an alumni of well over 1,000 people out of those awards, and I always say they benefit Australian universities even more in some ways than they benefit Africa. So let's work for it. Let this be a lobby group for the expanding the Australian Awards. When Ridwan Jadat is here, I know all the Australian High Commissioners in Africa, we have some of them here, will be very supportive of that. So that's one thing we need to do. We eventually set up an advisory group on Australia-Africa relations. And that was to harness groups like AAUN, the ADU, the African diaspora. That has gone. We need something. We need a Council on Australian-African Relations or something similar. It is amazing to see the growth of the African diaspora in Australia over the last 10 years. Wonderful to see you, Honourable, as a representative of that in Parliament. But in the National Parliament, we have more people born in Africa than ever before as well. And I think this diaspora needs to be harnessed more. We need a council of some form that harnesses those voices and builds that cooperation. So lobby for it. We need it back. We had an Australia-Africa leadership dialogue, a really significant one. I remember I was ambassador in Zimbabwe at the time with Julie Bishop coming over, still a shadow foreign minister. And Julie Bishop, when the government in it changes, as it inevitably and rightly does in Australia, was quite a champion in much more straitened circumstances for the relationship with Africa. In fact, it was Julie who, at an AGAR meeting, suggested to us we use the term Australia-Africa Week. So I'm glad to see that is still happening. As the Chancellor of the university I now I represent here, she has been a very dynamic force and is still a champion for us as well. Incidentally, I am aware ANU is not yet a member of AAUN. We're working on it, and I will be providing a report from this meeting, listening to the voices there, and I am very confident that you'll have ANU as a body that will also join with this. And there are other places. We heard the Zimbabwean ambassador. I think the University of Zimbabwe is not yet a member of AAUN. Looking forward to that, of course, with my background in Zimbabwe. So there is much to be done. Now, let me say, there are some encouraging signs from the Albanese government, not least with Tim Watts, the Assistant Minister's travels to Africa. He has committed, he said, the Australian government is reinvigorating our relationship with Africa. African nations are an influential voice of matters of importance for Australia, our region, the world. Africa also represents important trade diversification opportunities. I understand Tim Watts will make it here on Friday, and I think it's time now to put some substance behind that commitment. There is lots to be done. I'm encouraged, in fact, because I was contacted by the Deputy Secretary responsible for Africa, among other things, just before I came here. And he said, we want to have some advice from you on this. And I was obviously flattered by that. But what I want to do while I'm here this week is listen to African voices, all of your voices, so that it can help inform me in my recommendations. It's not a question of what's just in the past, it's a question of the future as well. Those who know me know I like my African proverbs, and there's one that says, a good day starts in the morning. We are still in the morning of the new Australian government. Let's make it a good day and start in the morning with a new Africa policy. Help us construct that. Thank you all.
Mainly related to medicine and health sciences. Very young academic unit, less than 15 years, but it became the third best academic unit in Ethiopia, the third best teaching hospital in Ethiopia in terms of specialists and subspecialists, and also like fellowship programs. So we will be doing a lot together. Ethiopia, is a landlocked country, but we use this term of land-linked country. So we are running even a maritime program and exporting trained manpower throughout the world. We will be doing that in other disciplines, and we are really talking.
Engagement, a partnership strategy. which really is focused on getting academia and industry working together. It is such initiatives that you can use to implement opportunities that are emerging from this Australian African Universities Network. With those few words, Franz, I would like to say, together we can change the world, as Nelson Mandela said.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
People are now producing double the amount of food per hectare in crops than they used to produce. So this has been a big change. However, despite producing lots of food, there's still 700 or 800 million people that are undernourished. And what does this mean? It doesn't necessarily mean they have lack of calories, but they have lack of essential nutrients. Common bean is eaten as a staple food. It's a very important source of protein in Africa. And we set out on our little AAUN project proposal meeting where we would thrash out this idea, why can't we increase iron and zinc in beans? And we were able to attract attention because of that AAUN meeting of ACR, the Australian Centre for International Ag Research, to try and get plant breeding to solve a few of these problems. Firstly, cooking beans takes too long. It costs too much to get the fuel, and it's mostly charcoal and wood to cook hours of bean cooking every day. And the smoke inhalation is causing huge health problems in Africa. So we were very fortunate in attracting the attention of both the Alliance of CIAT. At that point, we'll know if the project has been successful if at the end of the project we will have selected beans that are 30% faster cooking, 15% higher in seed iron, and 10% higher in seed zinc. And why is the ACR group, the Australian Centre for International Ag Research, why is it important? Because ACR likes to see Australian innovation being used to improve
and emerging. But my commitment to work with people from around the world is at the core of the work I do. I'm a global public health researcher and an educator. And as a migrant woman from India who has been welcomed in Australia, I acknowledge the indigenous people of India, the land of my birth, and also of Africa, where I lived as a young woman. So my journey started in Kisumu, Kenya in 1990, where I went as a young woman. And there it started in education. But it was my first exposure to HIV in sub-Saharan Africa and my interest in vulnerable populations. From there, I moved to Uganda and I embraced leadership in Uganda. I was in Uganda for 4 years and I met with the current Vice Chancellor of Makerere University. I was with the Aga Khan Education Services in Uganda, but I also worked at the Institute of Teacher Education at Chambogo with Makerere University, and after I came to Australia, I had a link up with the School of Public Health at Makerere University, where I had students who did their PhDs and Masters in Uganda and research projects in Uganda continue. I then moved to Rwanda, and I continued leadership in Rwanda at the Green Hill Academy. It was my exposure to refugees, rebuilding, and resilience that has underpinned a lot of the work that I've done and the research that I've done. I went back to Rwanda. It formed the part, my PhD was in Rwanda, but I went back to Rwanda in 2007, 2011, and I was in Rwanda in the middle of in June this year. And the school that I started at that time, I left the school in 2000 with 330 students. Today it's a bilingual 2,100 school, 2,100 student school with an IB curriculum. And I met with the current principal of the school, so that was a wonderful journey. So at the end of my PhD, I published a book on education reform in societies in transition. I selected 17 societies in transition, and out of those, 4 were from Africa, Rwanda, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe in Africa. There were other societies in transition from across the world. I was at Curtin University by then. I've been at Curtin University 20 years. I'm the Dean International in the Faculty of Health Sciences and Professor of Global Health. I'm also the Deputy Chair of the Academic Board. But I continued my link as a researcher
and as an educator. And here was a project that I conducted in 2011 to 2013 in Jinja, Uganda, in community health. This is with the Maasai in the Rift Valley in Kenya in 2013. And I started with participatory research projects where we listened to people's voices. So here I had, with the African diaspora across Australia, research that was conducted. And one of the things that I do in my participatory projects is use photo voice, where there are traveling exhibitions of photographs taken by people who have resettled in Australia. Currently, we have just finished a project with Ukrainian displaced people. But I went back to Africa recently, and some of you are here today. So I went to Rwanda and Ethiopia, and I met with colleagues from Baidar University, University of Rwanda, with the Rwanda Development Board and Mekele University. And the link continues. So to end, I'd like to bring us back to the Sustainable Development Goals. I lived in Africa from 1990 to 2000. I went back in 2007, went back in 2011 to teach at the University of Rwanda to the first cohort of the master's students in gender, culture and development. Went back in 2013 to undertake research projects in Uganda and Tanzania. In 2017, I was invited by the School of Healthcare Sciences at the University of Pretoria to build capacity.
AAUN initiatives to engage students and engage students in communities. I think that another way to be looking at it could also be to engage students with communities rather, and because sometimes that's a really nice way to look at things as well, and academics with communities. So I just wanted to make 3 points up front that I've been thinking about while I've been listening to other people today. And one thing that's come through front and centre from a few speakers is that universities are no longer just about getting an education to do a job. Like, we want our graduates from the university to be global citizens. We want them to be aware of the sustainability goals. We want them to know that the world is a complex place and that they could have a role in that place to change the world. And I
to now all of a sudden say, we need to somehow provide access to education. But I think the answer for me lies in terms of this kind of global network, lies in developing capacity of people that will go back to Africa. Right? So it's wonderful that students come to Australia for postgraduate studies. It's wonderful that we use this network for student mobility. But we need to create opportunities also through this network for students to go back, because that's the only way in which we can develop capacity for ourselves on the continent. Thank you.
From various parts of Africa. I'd like to acknowledge that we're sitting on the lands of the Wajak people of the Noongar Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. My name is David Mickler. I'm the Dean Global Africa for Curtin University, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this special dinner event this evening, which is a partnership between Curtin University's Centre for Australia-Africa Relations, the Australia-Africa University Network, and also acknowledge the AAUN team here tonight, as well as the Australian Institute for International Affairs, Western Australia branch, represented by President Brendan tonight. We've also just come from a really exciting and interesting forum all day today as part of the Australia Africa Universities Network annual event here in Perth, and we had some fascinating discussions about how we can deepen Australia-Africa relations. And some of the points that were touched on related to the theme of this evening around the concept of the Indo-Pacific and where Africa and African countries fit into that concept. And for those of us here in Australia, we hear a lot about this Indo-Pacific theme, but what we don't hear a lot about is Africa in the Indo-Pacific. And so for us, this is a really important conversation about linking up some of the geopolitical dynamics across the Indian Ocean and beyond, and thinking through what the Australia-Africa partnerships can mean in that context. So welcome everybody. It's great to also have a number of High Commissioners here and Ambassadors here. We have the Dean of the Africa Heads of Mission in Canberra, the Honourable His Excellency from Zimbabwe. Welcome. We also have the High Commissioner from Ghana here with us today. Welcome. We have the High Commissioner from Zambia. Welcome. And we have the High Commissioner from Mauritius. Welcome. I think that's everyone. We have Australian High Commissioners as well. Australian High Commissioner to Mauritius. And anyone else I missed? From Africa and the Indo-Pacific. So we've got a very distinguished panel for you this evening. We're going to read out their bios. We don't normally read out the bios